webinar. And what we're trying to do today is make sure that we provide, go back over all of the basic rules, highlighting some of the changes or the guidance that has been issued to make sure that everyone is kind of up to speed or needs a refresher perhaps on the materials that are provided for folks. So today on the line, I'm Les Warner. I'm from ICF International. And I think if you would, I think I'll ask the HUD folks to introduce themselves.
Hey Les, this is Hunter and Paul Patterson.
And Jerry Santana.
Larry Reyes.
Okay. So we've got some of the best minds in the business, and the way we're going to do this today is go through most of the material to get the basic information out, and then we've set aside quite a bit of time to be able to make sure that we are able to provide answers for your questions. So there are two ways for you to be able to ask a question. There is a question box that you can type in your question, and it will be read aloud and then answered during our question and answer session once we go through the basic materials. But you also have a way to ask a question over the phone by pressing in your audio PIN, the number that was provided on the information about the session, and that will essentially raise your hand. We'll know that you're in line, and we will then come to you and allow you to ask your question verbally.
Hey Les, really quickly, I just wanted to chime in with some details on questions. For asking your question orally over the phone, what we do request is that would only apply to folks listening in via their telephone today. If you're listening in via your mic and speakers, we'd prefer to keep you muted because on a lot of occasions there gets to be some pretty rough feedback. So we would prefer that if you're listening in via mic and speakers to just submit your question via the written questions box. But if you're listening in via your telephone, you're welcome to call in, or you're welcome to also submit your question via the written questions box.
Great. Thank you, Lee. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to be talking about, we're making the assumption that there's some folks that are brand new to NSP, have joined after the program was up and running and kind of need all of the basics. But we're also making the assumption that there's some folks that may have, with staffing changes or as the program has kind of evolved, might be taking on some new roles. There may be some developers or other folks that are new to this. So we're going to be talking about what is NSP, going through all the key rules and requirements, and that's not only on the front end on projects, and of course with program income coming in, there will be lots of folks still looking at eligibility for new projects and going through those regulations, but then also we'll be thinking about what will it take to close out your project and what will your ongoing responsibilities be once closeout has been completed. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things that folks have kind of learned over time on this, which may be useful in applying as you're thinking about what are the next activities I want to fund, and then of course we'll work in trying to answer questions as they come in. So the format in this, we have laid this out. So the NSP notices themselves, which will be referenced throughout the presentation, have been highlighted in red. And then the policy alerts, which are topic by topic, are referenced in green. At the end, there is a list of some of the top 10 or so policy alerts. There are a number of really useful toolkits that are posted, and all of this would be found on the HUD Exchange, which we've listed the linkage here for that. There are lots of very good, helpful field office staff, which we would encourage you to continue to work closely with. And there still is the ability to request technical assistance or submit a question through the Ask a Question system, all of which are done through the HUD Exchange site. So what is the NSP program? It's the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, and it was put in place to help local communities dealing with the onslaught of abandoned, foreclosed, vacant buildings that really were an outgrowth of the mortgage foreclosure crisis. And we had 3 funding cycles, NSP 1, 2, and 3. NSP 2 was a competitive process, and NSP 1 and 3 were an allocation. So as a total, we've got about 250,000 local governments, and all 50 states received funding through NSP 1, 2, and 3. And with those funds, a whole variety of activities have been undertaken and will be undertaken with the money circulating back through. Things, and we'll talk about the eligible activities in a minute, but they include things like financing, buying, rehabbing, selling or renting units, and then economic development as part of our NSP work within our targeted areas. Our benefits were targeted for low, moderate, and middle income households. So this is sort of a new term that is specific to NSP, where we are allowed to go up to 120% area median income, hence the LMMI acronym that we'll see as we go through this presentation. So a group of the population that in our other programs we've not been able to target and assist. So we're going to work through 15 sort of key elements of the NSP program, and really kind of starting from the planning process all the way through the closeout process to give you the basics on this. So let's just dive right into that. Here's the second half of that list. So on the front end are notices issued from 2009 to 2010, laid out the basics on the NSP program, where our work was going to be in areas of greatest need, and these targets were laid out based on the numbers of foreclosures that had happened, data about subprime loans, areas where it was predicted that we were going to continue to see a rise in foreclosure. And there were some other local factors that were included in this. So each grantee that received NSP funding identified within their action plan, their substantial amendment, laid out those specific target areas. And so the work that's being done through the initial awards and also through the subsequent projects that will be done through program income being received back in will need to happen within those defined target areas. So those target areas need to be laid out since our work is restricted to those in all of our written agreements. So it's very clear that subrecipients, state recipients, or developer that we're undertaking a project on your behalf understand that there is this restriction on where that project can be located. Also, the types of activities that you have selected to provide using your NSP funds were laid out in your substantial amendments, in your action plan, and we'll be talking when we get into the latter section of this about how that information will need to continue to be included in your con plan and action plans for the program income and revolving loan funds that you will continue to use for NSP eligible activities after closeout. So some of the options on how you actually would operate your program. You might be running a program yourself directly with your own staff, so marketing the availability of the activity, taking applications, processing, doing your review on eligibility, the underwriting that might be necessary. But many folks are also working with a subrecipient who has been designated to operate a program on the behalf of that NSP grantee. And a lot of our projects are being completed by developers who are being funded for a particular program. We also, in the mix, will have folks that are contractors, so they've been procured under our federal circular requirements, and they're acting on behalf of the NSP grantee or that subrecipient. A couple of policy alerts that relate to this that are referenced here. And for a lot of you, you've got a mix of things. So some projects you actually are operating yourself or with the subrecipient, and then a lot of our projects are being undertaken in conjunction with developers or folks that we've contracted with on this. So keep in mind that different rules apply, and we'll reference this a number of places as we go through, depending on what the role is. So a NSP grantee or a subrecipient are going to be under our procurement rules, under the federal circulars. A developer is going to be exempt from those rules. So when you choose to hire a contractor, you need to be following the procurement rules depending on what type of procurement that is. It might be a construction sealed bid procurement. It might be an RFP or an RFQ if we're contracting for services, some kind of technical support for our program. When you select a subrecipient or developer, they do not fall under the procurement requirements, but of course you as the grantee are depending upon that partner to bring the appropriate skills and capacity to be able to complete your project in compliance, complete it in a timely manner. So you probably, even though you are not held to procurement requirements, probably want to go through a process to make sure that the subrecipient or developer that you are selecting to partner with has the right staff, understands what the regulations, what the process is that's required as part of this when you make that decision. And of course, all of your partners need to have some kind of a written agreement with you, the grantee, which will lay out what their roles and responsibilities are, what their liability might be, and your expectations about timing and communication and budget. All those things need to be captured in that written agreement.
Hey, Les, this is Hunter. And one thing that really should be in that written agreement that we are seeing a lot of folks may have not thought of in the beginning of the program is how you're going to, how the subrecipients or developers or other folks that you have an agreement with, how things are going to function post-closeout. And so a lot of grantees probably should take some time now and sort of think about what they have in their written agreements and maybe what they need to adjust in their written agreements now that they're getting closer to a point of closing out the grant.
Yeah, I think that's a great, and I think we can hit on that a couple of times as we get into some later slides, but I do think for a lot of folks, as you go forward with new projects, you may want to think about the existing written agreement template that you're using and whether it doesn't need some updating. But as Hunter is mentioning, I would guess we've got a number of projects where the agreement that was executed early on, we hadn't all really thought fully through what are the roles and responsibilities, what are our requirements that need to be in place after closeout, and probably a lot of those agreements will have to have some kind of amendment or addendum executed to make sure that they really fully lay out what your expectations and requirements would be. Okay. So a couple of things related to activity and project administration that we need to talk about, and there have been some confusion over time, is essentially how are we going to support the costs of running a program. So with the NSP funding came administrative funds, and there's a cap on that of 10%. Following the same regulations that apply for CDBG, as you as an NSP grantee or subrecipient are receiving program income back, you are able to take 10% of the program income to be able to use to cover the admin costs for the reuse of those funds. So you need to make sure that you have a system in place that's tracking first of all, what your 10% budget is based on your allocation or award, but then also tracking program income and setting aside, if you choose as a program, setting aside up to 10% of the program income, which would fund to cover your admin costs. There are some options of costs that don't have to come out of admin, and those would be costs that are related to the actual delivery of the program itself. And so this option is for grantees and subrecipients. And those project delivery costs could be tracked as overall for a program that you were running, or they could be tracked specifically to each individual NSP project. So those project delivery costs for those properties do not have to be charged to your admin costs. But things like sort of the general operation of your program, ongoing compliance, public, dealing with the general public, marketing information, your con plan, action plan, those sorts of things will need to be billed against your admin costs. Where we've had some confusion is where we had folks who were developers who were requesting a developer fee, but also wanted to receive admin and project delivery costs. So project delivery costs and admin are for grantees and subrecipients, and they are not able to earn a profit. They're not able to receive a developer fee. A developer or a contractor, on the other hand, they can't receive admin or delivery costs, but they can charge all the actual project costs, and that includes things like appraisals, market studies, permits, all those sorts of things, their overhead and fees for that project. So there's been some confusion over time, and particularly I think developers heard the term admin, saw that some people were receiving that, and thought that that would be something that they ought to also have. One of the things that you always have a responsibility on as the administrator of federal dollars is to make sure that we're only reimbursing for costs that are eligible, but also that they are reasonable. So either through procurement or some kind of a cost evaluation process, and we need to be able to document how they are tied to the NSP project itself. So that means as part of processing our draw requests from developers, contractors, and subrecipients, and also internally, we need to be able to analyze those costs, have adequate backup documentation in our file, that we're able to show how this cost is eligible, how it's related to the NSP project, and then be able to show how we, what our basis is of defending that this is a reasonable cost. So in some of our cases, we have a procurement process, and we've gotten bids, so we have our lowest responsible bid that kind of sets what the reasonable cost or reimbursement should be for a particular scope of work. But in other cases, we're working with someone such as a developer where procurement is not required, and we need to have some other basis, whether it's looking at some kind of a cost estimation tool, looking at comparable costs within our portfolio, but some way to be able to evaluate those expenses and determine that they are appropriate. When we're dealing with labor costs, those need to be backed up with timesheets that not only show that that person was working that number of hours, but also to show that they were working on NSP versus CDBG, home, some other project. And all of that you need to have within your files or access to, let's say, a subrecipient's files to show that that appropriate backup documentation is in place, is in an auditable format. All right, so let's talk a little bit about timeline. So unlike many of our other CPD-funded programs, the NSP program had very aggressive time schedules in place as far as getting money obligated but also getting expended. We're well down the road on this process, so our original expenditure due dates for NSP 1 and 2 are both passed. That our NSP grantees were required to meet that 100% threshold. Now, keep in mind that threshold may have been met in a combination of spending from our actual line of credit or our award and with program income that was received. We'll talk in a little bit about the rule on program income and expending it prior to drawing down your line of credit funds. So in some cases, we have grantees who are fully expended, but they still have funds remaining in their line of credit. For NSP2 grantees, there is an expenditure deadline of September of this year. And so it's important to make sure that our NSP2 grantees are on target, on track to be able to fully utilize those funds, or those funds would be lost.
Let's just clarify that what we're talking about there is their line of credit funds.
Correct.
Left in their line of credit. Just because you're 100% expended, which I think all the NSP2 grantees now are, it does not mean that you have drawn all the funds that are in your line of credit, because like you're talking about spending program income first. So we did do a waiver, and that I think we're going to talk about in a little bit to help that out. But I just want to emphasize that you know, we're only talking about funds in their line of credit.
Right. And so folks need to be aware, what's my current position on this? What are the existing funds that are in that line of credit? And this is particularly specific to NSP, where we have the threat of loss of those funds if they're not expended. So under NSP 3, in 2013, grantees were required to hit the 50% mark, and then last year in 2014 at the 100% mark. But again, many of our grantees have unexpended funds in their line of credit because they met their expenditure deadlines with a combination of line of credit and program income funds that were expended. So it would be important to understand what your position is at this point and have a strategy on how you are going to make sure that those funds are expended. And we'll talk more in a little bit about program income. We'll mention about the creation of RLFs as some of the ways to deal with this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the property types. So essentially, there are 3 categories of properties and some different rules that apply for those specific types of properties. So the definitions, and we don't need to sort of historically talk about, but they evolved as the program went on. And so our definition for foreclosed properties, we have a few options. They can be 60 days delinquent under the Mortgage Bankers of America calculations, and the owner's been notified. We could have qualify as foreclosed if we have a property owner that is 90 days or more delinquent on tax payments. So they would not have to have been necessarily notified, but we would be able to document that they were at least 90 days delinquent. We also could have a property that foreclosure proceedings had either been initiated or may have actually been completed. And with those completed properties, if the title has been transferred to an intermediate, a holding company that is not the NSP grantee themselves, contractor, developer, or an end user, these still would qualify as a foreclosed property. So in many cases, a lender would take a property through the foreclosure process. It would be transferred from their portfolio into another entity that was a holding company for them. And so that is still considered to be a foreclosed property. At the point that it has been sold or transferred to a contractor, developer, or the end user, or you as the NSP grantee, it is no longer considered to be a foreclosed property. So for any properties that were qualifying as a foreclosed property, you need to make sure that you had documentation within your file that showed how you were meeting this definition as a foreclosed property. Next category, which gives you a little bit more flexibility, is an abandoned property. So this is where we have either mortgage or tax or a tribal leasehold where we have no payments that have been made for a minimum of 90 days. We also could have a property that, based on the condition, so if we have code inspections that show that it's not habitable and there's been no corrective action within 90 days, we can tag this as an abandoned property. We also may have some properties that are under a court order or receivership based on nuisance abatement or your own state's definition of abandoned. These would also qualify as an abandoned property. And when we get into the next section, we talk about the eligible activities, you'll see that some of our activities are restricted to one or more of these property types, which is why this becomes important. We also have vacant property, and this could either be where we have an unoccupied structure, but we also could have vacant land that was once developed. So it can't be a green site that has never had development, but there does not need to be any standing structure on that property. So if you were going to include a vacant property in your NSP program that did not have a structure on it, you need to be able to substantiate that this is not a green site, that it was previously developed and maybe cleared at some point or another. So this gives you some flexibility on the types of properties that would be available for you. We're going to talk in just a moment about the specific activities and the activity restrictions on this. One thing, this note at the bottom is important to understand. So we would have some properties that would qualify as both foreclosed and maybe abandoned or a vacant property. If it meets the foreclosed definition, then it has to be treated as a foreclosed property. And we'll mention as we move forward with foreclosed properties, we have some additional requirements about discounting of that purchase price and the documentation that needs to be in the file. So it's important to look at all three categories, and if it does qualify as foreclosed, we need to follow the foreclosed definition on this. All right. So a little bit about demolition under NSP. In some communities, a large amount of NSP funds were used for demolition. If we're doing demolition alone, we have to make sure that this property met our definition of blight. That would be well documented within our file. In your action plan or your substantial amendment, you as the NSP grantee would have laid out what your definition of blight was for your local community. These can be done where we're acquiring the property and we're going to demo the site, but we also might be looking at properties that were blighted within our community and contacting property owners and offering clearance to be able to remove these buildings. So we don't necessarily have to take ownership of the property on that. If we're doing demolition as part of rebuilding housing, we need to think about what the cost alternatives were in, does it make more sense to rehab this structure, or is it more cost effective to tear the unit down and do new construction? There is a policy alert that's noted here that I would recommend that you take a look at concerning demolition. All right. And these are just some examples around the country of units that were in communities that were blighting influence within those areas. And the NSP program provided an opportunity to remove some of these structures where previously there weren't funds to be able to do that. And this made a big impact on the viability of those surrounding structures and the chance to redevelop those particular neighborhoods. So here's where we talk about the eligible uses. So as you can see, and we're going to be talking through after this about national objectives, the NSP program borrowed some elements or is built upon some of the elements of the CDBG program. There are some elements of this that look a little like the home program, but it's a different process and rules and regulations, which is why we need to make sure folks are up to speed on the basics on this. So when the NSP program was laid out, there were 5 eligible uses, A through E. We're going to talk through each one of these. And as part of putting your local program design together, you would have laid out in your action plan, in your substantial amendment, of what of the 5 eligible activities you were actually going to undertake. So if later on, so now you have maybe completed your original NSP activities, but you are then working to find eligible uses for your NSP program income. It may be that you want to take on a different activity than you did originally. You need to make sure, are those activities listed within your action plan? And if not, that would need to be amended to identify that as one of the activities that you're going to undertake. So use A is strictly a financing mechanism. So we might be providing loans, affordability subsidies, and they might be going to individual home buyers or property owners. This might be going to a developer to help make an NSP eligible project possible. But this is restricted to financing mechanisms. Now, one thing I will note, first off, this is limited to foreclosed properties. So we went through our 3 definitions: foreclosed, abandoned, and vacant. Use A is more restrictive, that this is only on foreclosed properties. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that we had some confusion earlier on where folks thought, oh, well, if I was doing, let's say, a use B, where I was helping to purchase and rehab houses and I was going to sell them, folks had thought, well, if I want to provide something like a loan or down payment assistance, I need to also have use A funding set aside for that. Many of these things we can do under the other uses, and we'll talk about that when we get to A, but or B. But use A is specific to foreclosed properties, and it is limited to residential. So these are.
Can I point out real quickly that we have no one who has ever used use A?
We had a lot of people that set aside money originally.
Right, and then they've gone to the other uses. So no one's actually ever used use A.
But we have actually a number of folks who are thinking about going forward using that as part of their strategy with program income.
Right. They'll be doing a different activity. Everything you think you're going to do under use A, you really, if you think about it a little harder, you're going to find it's easier to do and possible under one of the other uses. Right.
And because use A is so restricted to foreclosed properties only, it's the least flexible, which is why folks aren't choosing to use that. Okay. So use B, you can see we're still talking about residential properties, houses, residential properties, but now we're talking about both abandoned and foreclosed. And this can be used for not only home buyer, but rental properties, and it can also be used for redevelopment. So we might be purchasing and rehabbing either single-family homes or multifamily housing, but we also might be doing reconstruction where we purchase, knock down, demo, and then under reconstruction, put a unit back in its place. So more flexibility than what we could have done under use A, and this would include, of course, all of our soft costs, rehab, and then any kind of affordability subsidy that was needed for that end buyer on these projects. So that's use B. Use C is something that's completely unique for us under NSP, something that we can't do under CDBG or home. And this was allowing us to be able to do land banking of homes and residential properties. it is restricted to foreclosed properties only. The issues here are that we have to they have to be within one of our defined target areas, and we need to have a 10-year plan because we will have to meet a national objective on each one of these properties. So it would be important as part of a strategy either with existing land bank properties that have been purchased under NSP or if we were considering additional land bank purchases, that we understand what is our 10-year reuse plan. We'll be talking more about this as we talk about closeouts on this. That part of our closeout process is going to be looking at what are our holdings for NSP under use C, and how are we going to meet a national objective to be able to close out these properties. Now, we had a number of properties that were acquired under use C, under land banking, but then were rehabbed, resold, but we need to have a national objective on this. Use D is we're simply tearing down blighted structures. So we're simply clearing out these structures. We are not replacing them. It is not part of a reconstruction process. Under NSP and NSP 2 and 3, a 10% cap was put on the percentage of your overall funds that could be used for demolition. Now, there was the possibility, or is the possibility, of requesting a waiver to have that percentage raised. And there are a number of communities across the country who have in place an approved percentage for demolition activities that are higher, in some cases substantially higher, than the 10% funds. So if you're someone that is newer to the program, you need to make sure you understand what is the cap that is in place for your community on demolition, and what's your current status as far as funds expended on that versus what your limit is. Use E has some additional flexibility where we're looking at redeveloping either cleared sites or vacant properties. And under NSP 1, you had the greatest flexibility where we could do things like public facilities. So parks or community gardens or a homeless shelter being built on our cleared sites within our target area. Under NSP 2 and NSP 3, you do have a restriction in place that they have to be related, these activities have to be related to housing. Now, one thing to keep in mind that we'll mention later when we get to program income is that you have a requirement to track your program income to the specific, whether it's NSP 1, 2, or 3. And one of the reasons you need to be able to do that is because you have more of a restriction on UC for NSP 2 and 3, we need to know what rules are going to apply for the program income that we're using. So some things that you can't do. We can't do foreclosure prevention. In some of these areas, foreclosure prevention is something that is needed, and there are other funds that could be used for that, but that is not part of the NSP program. We also mentioned before, if we're doing demolition itself on structures, that we need to be able to document that they meet our definition of blighting. And then because we talked about our eligible properties are being restricted to abandoned, foreclosed, or vacant, if we can't document that the property that we are interested in meets one of these three definitions, it is not a property that we can assist with NSP funding. So that's part of your eligibility review and criteria, and you need to make sure that that documentation is within your file on each one of these properties. All right, these are just some before and after examples of some structures. Okay, so here's where we talk about national objectives. This NSP is a program that is an outgrowth of the CDBG program. So much of this is similar to CDBG, but not all CDBG national objectives are eligible under the NSP program. So mentioned that our target goes up to 120%, so it's LMMI, so it includes middle income households. So if we were doing an area benefit, we would be looking at LMMA for area benefit, and we'd need to document that that area was meeting this 120% of median. So a different test than what we would use under CDBG. We don't have slum and blight, which we tend to use under CDBG for clearance activities. So we have our definition of blight we've been talking about for demolition. And typically when we're doing demolition, we are looking at an area benefit where the demolition is happening in an area where we have other NSP investments happening, and we're able to show that by removing this blighted structure from this targeted area, that we are helping to stabilize that particular area. We have housing as a national objective, and a lot of our activities are being done under housing. We might also have limited clientele, where we have housing that is for a specific sector of the population, and that would depend on the activity and also which NSP 1, 2, or 3 that the project was being completed under. We might have a mixed-use activity where we were doing job creation as our national objective, and then we would be following our job creation criteria that we have to show that jobs are made available or held by individuals that meet our LMMI moderate, low, moderate, middle income definition on that.
Les, can I just point out that the job creation is new with the closeout notice that went out about 1.5 years ago. And so if somebody's interested in looking into that, I'd recommend contacting the field office. It's not just limited to mixed-use activities. You could also do it in a situation where, for instance, NSP 2 or 3 grantee, we were talking about for eligible use E with housing, you could, you know, as long as you're taking something that formerly was a house and turning it into like a daycare center or something like that, you could do the LMMJ with that. So not a whole lot of people have done this yet, so this is new to us. So if that's something you're interested in, I would highly recommend contacting your field office and talking to them about it.
Great. I think that's very helpful. Okay, so here's where we go back to our standard rules that if you've worked under CDBG, you'd be familiar with, that when we are qualifying housing as meeting our LMMH national objective, we have to show if it's a single unit structure that that household that occupies the unit, looking at the income, gross income of all household members, meets our income limits for low, moderate, middle income households. So it's at 120%. In a duplex where we've got 2 units, then we have to see that one of those units qualifies. And anytime we're at 3 or more units, then 51% of the units must be occupied by LMMI households. So if we were doing a multi-family structure, we won't be applying what we typically use under home, where we're doing a cost allocation. We're looking at least 51%. So we're going to need to be able to document how rents are set, how income restrictions are set. So at least 51% of these units are benefiting a qualifying family. You mentioned a minute ago about LMMA, which is the area benefit, and we're typically seeing this when we're doing demolition, and we might have done this under NSP 1, where we were doing public improvements, in some cases where we've got economic development and land banking issues as part of our initial eligibility. An area benefit might be one of the ways that we meet a national objective. As we mentioned before, the special needs projects fall under LMMC, and then job creation, are meeting our national objective and documenting that is related to showing the jobs that were either created and held by or made available. And that goes back to CDBG national objective language on how we define job creation, how we document that. So we have a targeting or set aside within our requirements to try to make sure that a portion of our NSP funds actually benefit households that are lower income. So our target was set at 25% of our overall award has to create housing, so it's specific to housing, for low-income residents. And we're defining that as 50% of area median income. So that means that to be in compliance with this, 25% of your original grant amount and program income will have to meet this requirement. Keep in mind that you continue to generate program income. We'll talk a little bit about post-closeout, but prior to closeout, you need to make sure what's my current position on this. To be able to close out, you will have to show that you met this set-aside requirement. So 25% of the funds, not necessarily 25% of the units, have to be documented on this. If you were doing a shelter under NSP 1 on UC, those will not count towards this because it's not permanent housing. Group homes, if they qualify in your community, can meet this definition. Demolition doesn't count because demolition is not creating housing. Now, we might have a redevelopment project where a cost of that redevelopment was clearance and rebuilding, and so that would be, those costs are related to creating housing and would be part of this set-aside. So it would be important for all of the NSP grantees to know what's my current position on this, what was my strategy and is my strategy to meet this set-aside requirement. And going forward, as you continue to build program income and re-award that or allocate that to new projects, keeping in mind that my set-aside is growing over time and being strategic about trying to find some projects that are going to add to this. Some of our grantees have targeted for sale units as meeting this requirement. And so if to meet the low-income targeting set-aside, you have to sell a certain number of houses to a qualifying 50% and below buyer, you will not be able to show that you've met that national objective and met the 25% set-aside until you actually find that buyer and are able to complete that transaction. So knowing what your current position is would be important to know. How am I coming along towards that goal and being able to close out?
Les, I think it's also worth pointing out that that applies to renters too. You do need to have someone in the unit, yes, to count towards the 25% set-aside.
Yeah. And hopefully renters are going to be an easier challenge to find an income-eligible tenant. But, yeah, that needs to be in place. We've got some folks that are really struggling with finding buyers who are bankable. Okay, so acquisition requirements. We mentioned earlier that if we had a property that qualified as both abandoned and foreclosed or vacant and foreclosed, that we would need to follow that as a foreclosed property. And I mentioned that there were some additional requirements that go along with it. So if I have a foreclosed property, I need to make sure that I have an appraisal that was done within 60 days of the final offer. So we need to know that that appraisal is valid on demonstrating what is the current market value of that property. And that is part of our showing that we're required to purchase this property at a 1% discount from what current market value would be for that property. And that's why we have to have a timely appraisal in place. This is only for foreclosed properties. Does not apply to vacant and abandoned units. That's something that needs to be in place. We also have tenant protection requirements that are protecting tenants that were in a foreclosed property. And so we need to see that that foreclosed owner provided appropriate notification to those tenants before we actually utilize our NSP funds on purchasing that property. That notice went into effect partway in to the NSP program. I'm afraid I can't recall the effective date on that off the top of my head, but there will be some properties that went through the foreclosure process prior to the effective date of the tenant protection notice. So we need to know, is this a property that is held under the tenant protection notice, and have documentation in place that those tenants actually receive appropriate notice. The rules under the Uniform Relocation Act also apply, so property owners need to receive a voluntary sale notice. There are sample forms as part of the HUD Handbook 1378. If you just Google HUD 1378, that will get you to the URA handbook. I think you would also find that on the HUD exchange, and there are sample voluntary sale notices. Tenants also are covered under the Uniform Relocation Act. So if we put federal dollars into a project that causes the displacement of a tenant, whether they are income eligible or not, they fall under the Uniform Relocation Act requirements, and you could use the Handbook 1378, which would walk you through what are those requirements, what are your roles and responsibilities as an NSP grantee on notification, on making sure that the tenants receive appropriate benefits. So just part of the overlay of other federal requirements that apply. So underwriting and feasibility. There were not specific guidelines laid out for NSP, but you always, as the administrator of federal funding, have a requirement to make sure that you make appropriate investments of federal dollars, that you size them based on the need. And so being able to do that, you need to have some kind of written underwriting standards in place. For our rental properties and for our home buyer properties, there is a long-term affordability requirement, and we need to make sure that these are going to be sustainable. Whether it's for a home owner, that we're making sure that we're putting them in a structure that they can actually afford the payments and be able to afford maintenance, but also for our rental properties to make sure that that net income that's coming off of rents after paying the expenses will be adequate to maintain and sustain that property. So there are some tools in the NSP toolkit. There is a home subsidy layering notice that you could look to. For home buyer projects, there are some samples under Freddie and Fannie and FHA that lay out front-end, back-end ratios, loan-to-value ratios. For folks currently operating a home program, home buyer project, they are now required to have underwriting standards for both rental and home buyer. So it also might be that there will be some sources there to be able to use. So make sure that you have some kind of underwriting criteria, policies, and procedures that you're following, not only as part of sizing the level of NSP investment, but making sure that these are going to be sustainable projects for our NSP buyers and our developers. All right, so property standards. Under NSP 1, 2, and 3, you of course have to comply with whatever your local codes and standards would be. You may have state requirements in place. Under NSP 2, the applicants put in energy standards within their own application. And under NSP 3, there were some mandatory green rehabilitation and new construction standards. You're required to meet Energy Star standards. Many of our NSP grantees, when they put together their action plan, their substantial amendments, chose to adopt voluntarily additional standards, whether they were energy standards. Some folks chose to take accessibility standards, such as universal design or visitability standards. So make sure you know what your local, what your state requirements are, what was required under NSP 2 or 3, but then also what was your local program design. Because you need to be able to document that each of your properties, upon completion, actually meet what this overlay of requirements were, and that you've got inspections to document that, you've got work specifications that were put in place so that you can show that we have compliance on all of our properties where we've made an NSP investment. Here's just an example. It's just really the angle that makes the house look like it grew, but this is a nice example of an NSP project. So with our investment of NSP funds also comes a whole overlay of other federal requirements. The first and probably most timely on this is our environmental review requirements. So we know that with environmental review, we're not able to take any choice-limiting actions until the environmental review has been completed and the release of funds has been received. So before we can go through procurement, before we can sign contracts, before we can acquire properties, that environmental review has to be completed. Many folks have done what would be called a tiered approach, where they did their whole service area for an activity under a Tier 1 and are only then required, once they identify the specific property, to do a Tier 2 to essentially document the things that they could not have reviewed before they identified the individual property. So things like historic review, might be noise issues, proximity to underground tank storage, all sorts of things. So environmental review needs to be in place. Most multifamily properties will be done as an individual property environmental review. So if you are moving forward here, overseeing awards to new projects under NSP, you need to make sure that you have an environmental review process in place, that someone is responsible for this, and before these projects are able to move forward, that the process has been completed and the release of funds has been received. Uniform Relocation Act and the tenant protections we mentioned briefly before do apply. That also includes the acquisition requirements about voluntary and involuntary acquisitions of property. So some pre-planning involved, some administrative requirements, and there may be some budget implications if we're causing displacement for property. Davis-Bacon labor standards apply. So our trigger for CDBG is 8 or more units if we're talking housing. If we're not in housing, it is $2,000 is our trigger. So we need to be for construction. So we need to be, as part of our process, determining, will this project trigger Davis-Bacon, have the appropriate wage rates identified, include that in our bid packages, in our review. With that also comes the requirement on oversight on labor standards. So reviewing of weekly certified payrolls, making on-site visits and conducting interviews. So there needs to be a process in place. Lead paint requirements are going to apply. Pre-78 structures, we need to make sure that we are either stabilizing or abating paint surfaces. That needs to be part of our scope of work. We need to have appropriate risk analysis be completed on these properties and clearance testing. Section 3 is also applying, and that might be applying to our contractors and subcontractors. So our Section 3 policies need to be included in our procurement process. We need to be collecting and reporting on Section 3. That will be included in your overall NSP process. Of course, all of our fair housing equal opportunity requirements, and that includes Section 504. Section 504 has two aspects of it. One is based on employment and reporting, but also we have under housing set aside for both mobility and sensory. And so if we're doing either new construction of 5 or more units, or we are doing substantial rehabilitation with 15 units, and substantial rehabilitation is defined as the rehab is 75% or more of the replacement value for that structure. So that needs to be part of our analysis up front of, is 504 triggered on this project? Is the proposed scope of work in compliance with that? And that also needs to be monitored for compliance by the NSP grantee or the subrecipient. Keep in mind, on each of these things, we really have to analyze that particular project to look to see what the implications would be based on the scope of work, and make sure that those things are planned for, that you're able to provide appropriate oversight. And these things, again, would need to be called out within your written agreements. Some of these things have some implications on long-term compliance on properties. Also, NSP 3 required vicinity hiring requirements. So quite an overlay of requirements and sort of internal process to make sure that you have a way to maintain compliance on these requirements. All right. So let's kind of shift gears and talk about the financial requirements that apply. So we do have our federal circulars. These references are probably slightly outdated in that we have our new super circular, but A87 is where we lay out cost reasonableness, eligibility, and analysis on eligible cost reasonableness that we talked about. Our A133 audit requirements. And then Part 85 and Part 84 are for government and nonprofit entities, subrecipients of the financial systems that need to be in place, and in particular, procurement. So whether it's small purchase, sealed bid, professional services, that would need to be following the federal procurement requirements and be documented for each one of our projects. You are required to set up your projects, track expenditures, but also report the outcomes, the beneficiaries of your projects within DRGR. And so you need to make sure that with your subrecipients, with your developers, that you have systems in place to be able to collect that data, to be able to track expenditures and get that information into DRGR in a timely manner. And then a big topic that we need to spend a little bit of time on is talking about program income. The NSP program for many of our grantees for the long term will be producing some level of program income, and that has an implication on your financial management system, your requirements on reporting it, on its reuse, and timing of using program income versus funds remaining in your line of credit. So there, as was mentioned earlier, there was a NSP 2 waiver that was issued on February 2nd of 2015, and this is specific to NSP 2 for program income, a specific list of NSP 2 grantees. Let's talk about program income and the rule and what normally would apply. The rule normally would say that I have to expend program income that I've received first before I draw any money out of my line of credit. So if I have my NSP 2 award and I'm trying to spend that money down because I know I have a September 2015 deadline where I will lose that funding, until this waiver was in place, if I received, let's say, $200,000 in program income, I had to use that first rather than using the money that was in my line of credit that I had budgeted and planned to use for this. And so we've had communities that were experiencing difficulty in actually spending down the remaining money in that line of credit. So for NSP 2 only, and for a specific list of grantees, there is a waiver in place from this effective date that would say that I am not required to expend that program income first, that I can use my line of credit, spend down that money first before using my program income. And that will allow those specific grantees to make progress towards spending down their existing funds in their line of credit rather than lose them with the deadline. So things that are a source of program income. So any money that's coming back to you, the grantee, or a subrecipient is going to be categorized as program income. So if we've got a property that you acquired and rehabbed and then you're selling, if there are proceeds from that sale that are coming back to a subrecipient or grantee, that's program income. It holds its federal identity. It must be expended first. If I have loans that have been made and I have, let's say I have a developer that received an NSP loan for a multifamily project, and they have an amortized loan that they're making regular payments on, that principal interest, as they pay it back to you, is considered program income. If we have, for our home buyer projects, a unit that is sold or transferred under our recapture provision prior to completing that affordability period, those funds are considered under NSP, are considered program income, and will have to be tracked as program income. If we are earning interest on program income while it's sitting in our account while we're waiting to find an eligible reuse for that, that is also tabulated into our program income. And then if we have liens that we've placed on private properties for demolition that was done, and those get paid back at some point, if the money's coming back to a grantee or a subrecipient, that's going to be considered program income, and all of those requirements will apply. So you notice we've referenced program income as being defined by money coming back to a grantee or a subrecipient. If I have someone who has been set up as a developer, then money coming back to them is not program income. And we've had some projects where we had a subrecipient who was serving as the developer on a project and was going to be owning, let's say, a multifamily project. If they are defined as a subrecipient with your written agreement, then the money coming back to them is program income and will have to be tracked and spent accordingly. So the rules that apply with the use of that program income. Every time that money comes back, doesn't matter how many times you loan it out, it keeps its identity as NSP funding. It will continue to be federal dollars, so all of the other federal requirements are going to apply on that. Doesn't matter how many years later, it will still be considered to be program income even after you have closed out. Program income that's earned after you've actually closed out your NSP grant will generally follow the NSP rules, but we're going to talk in a few slides about this. There are a couple of exceptions depending on who the grantee actually is. We'll talk about that here, and also under the closeout guidance, there's also some more detailed information on this. So grantees can think about, do I want all of the program income to come back to me directly? You could choose to allow a subrecipient to hold on to that funding, but keep in mind that you, as the NSP grantee, retain that responsibility to make sure that it is being tracked, that it is being spent appropriately, and then all of the federal requirements that go along with program income are still being followed. So you have a policy decision to make about who's going to hold on to and oversee that program income. So it has to be used for another NSP eligible use. It will have to be in with one of the target areas. Has to meet a national objective, as we talked about. We mentioned this issue about the set-aside, low-income housing set-aside at 25%, and the fact that as we accrue program income, it's 25% of that program income also. So it's a growing issue. And then all of these other federal requirements that we've talked about do apply. We also did mention that you're able to take 10% of that program income to cover your ongoing admin and planning costs. So I mentioned that program income has to be tracked separately for NSP 1, 2, and 3. That's really because we have some variance in what the rules are for each of those program rules. So for example, we talked about use E, that we could do a public facility under NSP 1, but NSP 2 and 3 were required to be housing. So it's those sorts of requirements that follow with this that we really need to be able to track which of NSP 1, 2, or 3 were these funds generated from, and so that it holds that identity. Those are going to be continued to be tracked and reported on in DRGR after closeout. So some of the project completion requirements that you will have to meet. We need to make sure that for a home buyer program that purchase price met the affordability test that you defined in your action plan. For a rental property, if there was a subsequent sale, there's no limitation on how much they can sell that property for. The limitation is on the affordability of those rental units. So we would continue to look at income-eligible tenants and affordable rents for those properties. So if we sell to an assisted household, we can't accept that sale price higher than what we actually have invested in that property. So if I acquired and rehabbed a house, let's say I spent $120,000, but and I'm going to sell it at fair market value, and fair market value is $150,000, I'm capped at that lower figure because my only total investment was $120,000. Now, for a lot of NSP grantees, they have spent much more than what the fair market value reflects, and so the maximum they can sell it for is what the market will bear, the fair market value on that. Part of that you can include when you're looking at tabulating what your investment is, not only your direct costs, but also your activity delivery costs. So you need to be able to track those back to the property. You can't include maintenance costs. So once you have completed the property and you are holding that property and have some ongoing maintenance costs, those are things that cannot be included when you calculate what your maximum sale price could be. You need to make sure that those units that are being sold are inspected for compliance with your standards, and we're going to document our national objective. On a home buyer unit, typically we are looking to see that we are selling it to an income-eligible buyer. And as part of that, we're going to be reporting that in our QPR and the DRGR, showing that we have an eligible buyer and reporting that beneficiary information. So we have an ongoing affordability period. And for most of this, most folks borrowed essentially from the home program and used those rules as our safe harbor for home buyers. This policy alert from 2009 that you may want to take a look at. So as part of this, for our home buyer program, you as an NSP grantee had to determine whether you were going to do resale or recapture. If you weren't going to do one of those options from the home program, then you needed to lay out in your action plan some other variance on that. I think most folks did recapture as their process. So as part of that, you would have laid that out in your policies and procedures. For rental projects, you have an affordability period that's going to be based on your compliance period, and in most cases that's going to follow the home program based on your investment. And so depending on your investment level in a property, you may have 5, 10, 15, or 20 years of affordability requirements where you're going to be tracking to make sure that rents remain affordable and that incomes are meeting your affordability definition that was included in your application. Keep in mind that if the way you are meeting your 25% set-aside is designating rental units as being for households at 50% and below, then we need to make sure that we continue to have affordable rents for those units. And each time we have a new tenant, so when we have the turnover of those tenants, that we again rent it to a household that's at 50% and below. It's not an issue if we have somebody who rents a set-aside unit, their income's at 50%, and over time their income goes up. The issue would be when that tenant moves out and we rent a new tenant, we have to verify and make sure, are they meeting our 50% or below requirement. If we have a sale on a rental property during that affordability period, we need to make sure that our restrictions stay in place and that that property will continue to provide affordable housing for income-eligible buyers. So here's where we talk about our reporting and our closeout process on this. So within 30 days of quarter end under NSP 1 and NSP 3, you're required to file your QPRs, your quarterly reports. Within 10 days of quarter end for NSP, those need to be filed, and they're required to be posted. So this is part of our transparency, citizen participation on this program, that those quarterly reports need to be posted. I've noticed with a number of NSP grantees that some of that was posted early on, but they've kind of let that go. That's a requirement that it be posted. Your CAPER or your performance report is not required for NSP, but of course as part of our closeout process, we're going to be documenting how were our funds used, who was benefited. Make sure that you have documents that show compliance for all of our requirements. So some kind of compliance review, eligibility review. There are some HUD monitoring checklists that you could use as a self-assessment. I believe you would find those on the HUD exchange. So let's talk a little bit about change of use. This is a CDBG term that folks may be familiar with from CDBG. So this applies to property that's owned by a public grantee in perpetuity, or if we have a subrecipient or nonprofit with permission of the grantee. So this is triggered when we've expended $25,000 or more and when a property is sold or demolished. And the issue here is that if we triggered this by the $25,000 or more, then we must continue to meet the original, either the original national objective or another alternative national objective for this property. Or we have to sell the property at current fair market value and return those sale proceeds as program income. So these are long-term when it's owned by the public grantee or subrecipient, and only triggered at 25% and above. So if we had a property that we held, let's say we did asbestos removal and demolition on a property, and we had expended $80,000. We sell this vacant lot at current fair market value, and maybe the fair market value is only $10,000 for this vacant lot. Change of use would require that if we're not going to continue to meet a national objective, that we have to pay back those proceeds, which is the fair market value, and that becomes program income, so it retains its federal identity. There is a policy alert from March of 2013, which provides more detail about disposition, and there is some flexibility in this, and I think that policy alert will give you some very good guidance about the details on this. So, closeout notice. So we have two things. We have a closeout notice, which was issued in November of 2012, but then we have our closeout guide, which is more recent. from last year. And this really walks you through in really good detail of the closeout process, what the requirements will be, gives you some examples of forms and templates to use, and kind of guides you through this. So the criteria to be ready to be able to close out. All of your costs have to be paid that have been incurred with NSP. So, and all the work has to be completed. So if you were in a region of the country that has winter and you have some aspect of your project that you're holding funds for can't be completed until spring, we aren't going to meet this closeout criteria until all of the work has been completed and those funds have been released and paid for those NSP costs. You also have to be able to show that you meet your set-aside requirements for housing at 50%, benefiting folks at 50% and below. So you need to know what's my current position on this, be able to document that you've met your 25% set-aside on this. All of your other requirements, meeting a national objective, all of our other federal compliance requirements will be required to be completed to be able to move forward with a closeout. As part of that, you will prepare a final QPR. You will go through a closeout checklist. HUD will review that checklist, work with you, and at the point that you are ready, HUD will prepare a closeout agreement which will be issued and will be signed, and that will lay out what protocol, what requirements will be going forward for that particular project. So some things about after closeout. So as we mentioned, many NSP grantees are going to have program income coming in for hopefully many years from NSP-funded projects that will come back in the form of program income and will continue to be funded for eligible activities within your target areas. So your action plan will need to lay out, continue to identify what are the activities that I'm going to undertake, where are my target areas. As part of that, you will continue to be able to take 10% from your program income to be able to support that. All the other federal rules will apply. Generally, the set-aside requirement will apply, but we're going to talk about a couple of exceptions in a moment. So we have to think about post-closeout, if I'm going to fall under the set-aside requirements, how am I going to fund projects and have a strategy to stay in compliance with those requirements. We'll also need to continue to report on the status of NSP affordable units during their affordability period. So here are the exceptions about closeout. So if your annual program income is less than $25,000, then you're able to use it to administer your NSP program, or you could add it to your CDBG program income and treat it under the CDBG rules as opposed to NSP. So it would essentially lose its NSP identity at that point. If your NSP program income is more than $25,000 but less than $250,000 on an annual basis, then your set-aside requirements are waived. So it makes it easier for you as far as implementation. But all of your other rules about eligible activities, target areas, other federal requirements still continue to apply to those funds. We also have a sort of a group of NSP2 consortium members or non-entitlement NSP3 grantees that don't have an open state CDBG grant. So in those cases, those funds, after they're received, are going to remain program income. But if we have no other HUD grant, then the revenue that's received during 5 years after the program income or after the closeout is not going to be considered program income. But you still need to find eligible activities. You you still need to meet a national objective. Same would go for income that's received after the 5 years after closeout. It's not considered program income, but we're still holding you to finding other eligible activities and continuing to meet a national objective for the reinvestment of those funds. Affordability, keep in mind for our designated NSP units, those affordability requirements stay in place. You have long-term oversight monitoring on these units. You periodically will be required to report on the status of those using DRGR. If we have funds that are recaptured from our sold or transferred homebuyer units, those dollars are going to have to be used again for another eligible activity. You're going to be required to do some ongoing monitoring and reporting on your rental units. It is, for those of you that work with the home program, it is more flexible than home. So we have to show that we have affordable rents. Our income eligibility has to be shown at initial occupancy and anytime we have turnover, but otherwise does not need to be documented on an annual basis. And again, we can use our NSP admin funds, which we can take up to 10% of our program income that we're receiving over time to fund, to cover our expenses on that. Some other things after closeout. For land bank properties, properties have to show that within 10 years of closeout that they're going to be obligated and committed, and that they're meeting a national objective, that they're going to continue to support neighborhood stabilization. In the closeout memo or notice and guidance, there's further guidance about some of the flexibility that's been provided for how you are able to meet national objective for those properties. So I would recommend that you take a look at that. And again, we talked about the 25% set aside and affordability requirements that apply except for the exceptions that we actually talked about in the last slide. So some things about your post-closeout program. You could go ahead, just keep funding the same projects that you've been doing. And it may be that if you've got partners that have shown that they have capacity and the market stays in support of those activities, that may be a very good model for you. Others are going to find that the needs have changed, the capacity of some of your partners, that local market, and may need to rethink what activities you're going to undertake, also looking at what's your own capacity as the grantee or subrecipients or developers that you may have worked with. So you may be going back to folks that you worked with in the past, or you may be changing your program. And I would encourage folks to really evaluate what's working for me, what's not working. Are all the factors that made it work last time I did it still in place, or do I need to amend my project design going forward? So some of the things that have been lessons learned that have worked well for folks is making sure that they have the right team, that they brought the capacity to the table. If they didn't have it internally, that they paired with good developers, with subrecipients, that they were very clear on who their target audience was, who the target market was, and knowing what was happening in those target areas, that they're leveraging other program funds. And that may be more critical going forward, working with programs. Thinking about how's this going to work in the long term. How long will I continue to receive program income? What will those levels be? How will my investments continue to work within those areas? As part of that, folks found that it was really important to do a really good job of underwriting, right-sizing that investment, making sure that they didn't make these deals so tight that if anything unexpected happened, that there were problems with the stability on this, and actually having systems in place that not only you as the administrator, but also the recipient understood what the criteria was, how it would work, and folks could follow that. NSP was an opportunity, unlike many of our other programs, to put in higher levels of subsidy to get projects that maybe otherwise couldn't be completed in your community. This also allowed you to do some deeper targeting on income and special needs populations. Also, for folks that were able to move their programs well, they had good private lending partners who understood their program, and they had worked out how that process would work. And that avoids a lot of problems if you've got a good program design and everybody understands their role in this. Timeliness has been a big factor for this program from day one, and will continue on this. You've got to have your environmental reviews as part of this, and that needs to be worked into your timeline on this and planned ahead. You may continue to be in a situation where you are competing in those target areas with other buyers, and so using programs like the First Look program to get first access to some of our foreclosed properties may be an important model to continue to follow. And many folks over their NSP experience found that they needed either more control over developers or partners, or they needed a way to be able to cancel or cut back or control partnerships. And I think looking back for you at what worked, what didn't work, and see if there are some things that could be prevented by some changes in your protocol, maybe your written agreements, would be important. As part of this, you need to be actively involved, and will need to continue to be actively involved. You may have a smaller staff, and so those roles may need to be redefined. But making sure that we've got all of our federal requirements, we've got eligible activities, we're following the OMB circulars and program income requirements, all of that, it needs to remain to be in place. Again, written procedures, our written agreements with our partners become really important, and keeping an eye on and trying to work towards maintaining the capacity with our partners, our developers, would be important. We have other community-based partners in both CDBG and Home. Home, we have our community housing development organizations, CHODOs. Under CDBG, we may have our community-based development organizations, CBDOs. And we may need to shift how we deliver some of our ongoing projects as some of that capacity changes. DRGR is not going away, so having maintaining some DRGR capacity is going to be important on this. So again, looking at the end use, looking at what's happening in that market, and making sure that what we're doing going forward on reusing our NSP funds, that we still have a workable program design and everyone understands their role. So that was a lot of information kind of top to bottom on this. But I think what we'll do now is switch into the question phase of this webinar. And so I think we'll first, I'm thinking we'll first take the questions in the question box. Lee, do we have questions that have been submitted?
We do. We do have a couple questions, so I'll just jump right in. The first question is, are there citizenship requirements for a potential buyer of an NSP property? And if so, is it permissible to have a legal U.S. citizen sign onto the deed as a co-registrant? Or can someone with temporary citizenship status sign the deed alone?
Okay, I'm going to give an answer, but I'm going to ask Hunter and folks to chime in on this. So my understanding would be that CDBG, and I would believe that applies to NSP, requires that you be a legal resident. And so that might be defined in a number of ways. But so the
last,
yeah.
Let's just, the actual answer is that, and you guys are going to love this, is that the Justice Department is currently writing regulations concerning this as required by the Welfare Reform Act of 1996.
Okay.
And if they would like that language, send a question to the Ask a Question, and we could send you the legal response that we've received from our general counsel specifically answering that question that you can use if need. But I'll say it again. We're waiting for the Justice Department, and they say they're working on it since 1996.
So in the interim, what is your suggestion to this individual who's trying to figure out, do I say yes or no to this person?
I would say that I would refer to, I would send that question on Ask a Question, and we will send you an answer.
Okay. Okay. All right. Moving on, Lee.
All right. So if a son and a father can sign a deed together, must the son be living in the home?
So our eligibility here is based on the household, and that is the household that resides in the property. So we've had quite a number of properties where we have a co-signer that is a non-residential, a lot of times has been an adult child. The issue is that if it's the father that's going to reside in the unit, we have to look at all household members and show that he is income eligible.
Yeah, the big thing there is that if you use, it's usually the other way around, so it's a little easier, where it's a father or a parent co-signing on a child. And what you just need to be cautious is that if they are declaring on their IRS forms that that person is dependent, then you have to take everyone's income into account. If they're not, if it's just, if it's a father as a co-signer, but they're not declaring them as dependent, then you do not need to take that father or mother's income into account. So it would be the reverse here in this situation.
Yeah. Well, I know we've had a number of, with the grantee I worked with, that we had elderly parents who the son or daughter actually purchased the house for the parent, but the parent themselves was income eligible, and so it worked. But we could have both directions on this.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question.
Okay. Next question is, can NSP funds be used for both operations and capital needs of a multifamily project?
Well, so when you are funding that project, you are looking at a development budget of what it will take to build it. You are restricted as far as being able to capitalize reserves on this. So you are really depending on the operations to be funded by the income coming in. So it has made it difficult for targeting very low income populations where the rents that are coming in maybe don't actually generate enough, even if you had zero debt on the property, might not generate enough revenue to pay all of your operating costs. So my understanding would be that our eligible costs for this project are the development of it, but we don't really have a way to capitalize some kind of ongoing operating under NSP. Hunter, do you guys want to add anything on that?
No, we agree with that 100%.
Okay. Next question.
Okay, this one is a little bit of a long one. So this person is asking because they are about to enter an NSP contract with Habitat for a single-family home on a Habitat-owned vacant lot. They just finished the environmental review today, and their questions are they correct that Habitat's acquisition costs are not a reimbursable expense? And two, was their acquisition, which was in 2012, a choice-limiting action because no environmental review was done back then?
So I'm going to say a couple things and also condition a couple of things. I am not an environmental review expert, but here's the things I see on this. So some of this may be a timing thing. So when Habitat acquired the property, they might have acquired it for this NSP project, and in that case, we probably have issues under environmental review. But Habitat may have acquired this property and not really related to this project, and is coming forward with, hey, I'd like to do this NSP project. We have now said, look, we need to do an environmental review, so that the acquisition wasn't actually part of this project. So I think
to clarify, they did say the plan was to build. Excuse me. The plan to build on it did not arise until recently.
Okay, good, good. So I'm going to take that as the acquisition happened by Habitat for some future use, not anticipating NSP. So my understanding of the environmental requirements would be that at that point we need to take no further action, complete the environmental review, and depending on what the outcome of that environmental review, if it determines that yes, this is an appropriate site, or we need to do some mitigation of some kind, but once that has been completed, that project would be able to move forward. And it sounds like they've now completed the environmental review. They could then provide funding for that project if it appeared to be an appropriate NSP eligible project and all of that. Hunter, you guys want to add anything?
I think that one thing we want to stress on this is that we're only hearing partial details here, so that this is not something that we can answer in this format, with 100% certainty. But from what you said, I think we all agree with what you're saying.
And we would recommend, if they want, just to feel comfortable, this is in Jerry, that they go ahead and submit, I guess, into the ask the question.
Or contact their field office.
Contact the field office, the full scope of what's going on with the project. I think that also allows us to go back and forth with any additional questions that we may have.
I think it's really helpful because a lot of these, one missing detail in the description can change a lot of this.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Lee, next question.
Sure. I am getting a lot of questions about the webinar materials and scrolling back to certain slides. I just wanted to make a plug that these webinar materials will be available on the HUD Exchange website in the coming week. Okay, so now back to a content question. So a grantee has a sub-grantee that has a property in a land bank and owned by a redevelopment authority. The redevelopment authority is in the process of finding a developer and financing to develop the property for housing. In the interim, the redevelopment authority wants to pave the lot and temporarily use it for public parking. Is this temporary use prior to the development of housing permissible?
I'm going to defer that to Hunter and his crew. I think this has come up before.
Yeah, it would be permissible, but you can't use NSP funding to pave the lot.
Right.
So, I mean, if you want to do something in the interim, and we recommend that with land banking, a lot of times people maybe do a community garden or something like that. That's fine. It's just you cannot use NSP funds to do that interim use, whether it be, paving a lot for parking or building a park. You just need to come up with another source of funding to do that.
And they can't lose sight of the fact that they still have an end use and a national objective to meet, and kind of not forget, oh, this is just a parking lot, I don't have to worry about this.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting, the parking lot, if you were hiring somebody to manage it, we could make an argument that might be a job creation there. So that, I mean, that's think of whoever asked that question might want to mull that one over a little bit and go back and look at the closeout notice that deals with the job creation national objective.
Great. Next question.
All right. Next question is, do I have to live in the state in which I'm administering the NSP program?
What? Do you have to live in the state that you're administering the NSP program?
Are they a consultant?
I'm not sure what their role is.
There's not a residency.
No.
There's not a residency requirement for staff. I would think there's a concern about availability and being able to kind of have appropriate oversight. But NSP itself doesn't really talk about for the staff that's running a program. The funds are obviously provided and held by an NSP grant or subrecipient, but where their staff actually resides, I don't think there's any.
This is Paul. We don't have a federal requirement for that. The local government may have their own staff requirements where the staff have to live within the jurisdiction, but that's above and beyond what our requirements are.
And that's sort of dovetailing off what Paul's saying, is that that's true for most of our requirements. These are the minimum requirements that states and grantees and the nonprofits who are using these funds have to meet. They are more than willing, and in many cases do, add additional requirements to all of these, and that is okay to do.
Okay, great. Next question is, so if a parent is not a U.S. citizen, I think this actually is a question that piggybacks off the previous question about citizenship. So the parent in this situation is not a U.S. citizen. Can the son co-sign, who is a legal resident, can that bypass any regulations that would bar the undocumented father?
We need to get that question submitted to us. I can't answer that over the phone. It's just
Okay.
There's a lot of other details that we would need. So if they could submit that question to the Ask a Question website, the HUD Exchange, we'd be happy to respond. But it might involve some back and forth. That's why it's just going to take a while.
Okay.
Great.
All right. Then we will move on. Okay, so next question. If a grantee has chosen to use home rents, they have the option to determine the utility allowance based on the type of utilities used at the project. May they base their calculations on the utility allowance data provided by the Public Housing Authority, as long as it is specific as to gas versus electricity, for example, and one utility company's rates versus another?
Well, the home program allows you, there was a delay in the implementation of the HUD utility calculator. So their methodology that they're proposing of using the public housing utility allowance is fine. They need to know what is that tenant actually responsible for. You might, as the NSP administrator, if you have a more efficient, energy-efficient property, you might want to look at some kind of an alternative schedule that would be more appropriate for the actual utilities incurred by that property. But you would be fine in using what you're proposing, as I understand it.
All right. Then moving on, is a vacant brownfield property that was not previously developed eligible for NSP funding if the intended project meets NSP criteria?
So we said that our definition under vacant is that it can't be, it has to have been previously developed. And so they're saying it's a brownfield. I assume meaning it's been contaminated. So I guess I'm not sure, I don't know, HUD folks, what you want to do with this.
Well, I guess I'm a little confused how you can have a sort of a green space that's also a brownfield. I mean, if you could show that there was a factory there 50 years ago, that's a prior use property.
I suppose it could be runoff sort of thing.
I mean, if it hasn't been used for something before, then you can't. It's not considered vacant. With the runoff, but still, you still run into that problem that we're not calling that a vacant lot.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. So I don't think if there's not been a structure there before, then that is not then you have a problem. Now, if it's a large lot and there was a factory on one side, I mean, that large lot would qualify. You don't have to build it in the footprint, but
and we have had some grantees that ended up doing some research and find, maybe in no one's recent memory, but we found that there were some lots that at one time or another had been actually developed, and they were able to then prove eligibility in that. So yeah. I think, again, they've got to meet that definition.
We agree.
Okay, Lee, next question.
Okay, great. Next question. If a grantee has an abandoned home with county tax liens going to tax lien sale, can they use NSP fees, or I guess they mean funds, for purchase and rehab?
And tell me again, this is the city or this is the county?
This came from a city person, so this would be the city.
So if the city,
yeah, the city could pay the county's fees if they're acquiring the property. It gets a little sticky if the city's paying itself the fees.
Yes.
Okay, next question then. Where can one find out which municipalities have been allocated NSP funds and how much has been allocated?
The HUD Resource Exchange will have, if you go to About Grantees, we'll have a list of all the grantees of all the HUD programs. And you can search through there for just NSP if you want.
All right. Then to keep it rolling, next question. So for the question regarding habitat, it seemed that the question was if NSP could be used for the acquisition for the property. If the environmental was done after the acquisition, they believe the answer would be no. Is that correct?
Well, so if Habitat's asking to be reimbursed for the value of the property, I guess my thought would be when you sell that property, that the portion of the proceeds that are related to the value of that property, that they could be reimbursed at that point, and that would be the most appropriate way for this to be structured.
Unless the thing is, those proceeds would not be considered program income. That would be
right.
A percentage of, if whatever that acquisition cost would be considered an other source of funding.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay. We have two more questions. Let's see. Actually, yes, two more questions. If this person has a blight abatement costs, which are eligible under NSP 1, but they have not done an environmental, can they do one after the fact and still cover the costs with NSP? The the costs were fronted by a local funding source.
So this is a property, I guess is this a property they've actually done something on? Or they did some kind of an assessment, but they did not use NSP funds to actually, like clear the site?
Right. The phrasing of the question makes it sound like they have not. Oh, actually, they just entered a follow-up. Yes, they did the work already. Okay.
So my take on this would be they have violated the environmental review requirements that would say that it has to be done before you take any choice-limiting actions. My thought would be that it would not be eligible, but I will defer to the HUD folks.
No, we agree with you. That sounds like it's not eligible.
Yeah.
Okay. One next question. It seems more of a statement, but it's a follow-up again on the habitat question, saying that they would get no sales proceeds, just a 0% mortgage.
Well, but so if I understand the normal habitat design, so Habitat owned this property. You're putting in NSP funds to do I would assume, construct a unit or maybe to rehab an existing unit. it's going to be, and Habitat is the owner while that project is ongoing. It's going to be sold then to an eligible buyer. Habitat is going to hold a mortgage on that property. It will be amortized, and those funds are going to come back to Habitat over time. So there will be funds coming back to Habitat. And that would, I guess my thought would be they would be, assuming they've been set up as a developer that's not program income, that's going to be the repayment. And I would assume that that loan that they've made incorporates the value of not only the value of the property, but probably the rest of their investment, including perhaps some of the donated materials and labor that they're going to be receiving payments on.
And unless, if they're not a developer, if they're a subrecipient or the grantee themselves, then it is, then you would take a percentage of, if you spent,
right,
property was the house sold for $100,000 and the property value is $10,000, then they would receive 10% of the payment, and NSP would receive 90% in program income.
Right. So there's still a way for Habitat to recoup those expenses. It's not an immediate hand over the NSP money for that.
Okay, we do have a couple more questions left. I know you said that you had to cut it short, but I can redirect these questions to our HUD panel that are still staying on.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so the next question would be, as a lead member of a consortium, this person will be providing, or this grantee will be providing construction funding under Activity E for a rental project that will house families and individuals at 30 and 45% AMI. The local jurisdiction is also providing financing. They're using a 60% AMI affordability restriction, and the city is using 45% restriction, with the possibility of increasing to 60% in the event of foreclosure by a senior lender, and their loan will be paid back at the time of conversion. Can those units be considered LH25 with the 60% affordability restriction? I know that's pretty detailed.
No. You have to make, the person living in the unit has to be at 50% AMI or less. It sounds like, I mean, and they have to, during the period of affordability, they must be at 50% AMI or less. So it sounds like what they're saying is that they're going to go from, they're at 45 right now, but there's a possibility they go to 60. And the answer is no. They can't count towards the 50% AMI or less. That's LH25 set aside. Now, if they could ensure that during the period of affordability that they would only, new renters would only be at 50% AMI or less, then yes, they could. But that doesn't sound like what they're saying.
Okay, then we'll go to the next question. So for NSP1 homeownership.
Hey, Lee?
Yes.
Can we see if there's anybody on the phone before we continue?
We actually don't. Nobody has raised their hand yet, but I will reiterate, if you would like to ask your question orally, if you're using your telephone to call in today, go ahead and use the raised hand function. Otherwise, you're welcome to submit your question via the written question panel. And in the meantime, we'll keep going through written questions. So for an NSP1 home ownership question, how do you define permanent residence if the owner is temporarily working out of state but still has mail routed to this address? Does that count?
It needs to be their primary residence. So they need to have that be where they're, quote unquote, living. If they are, if they bought the home and are renting their old home, that's fine. But that rental that they're getting, rental income they're getting from their old home counts towards their income certification. But it needs to be where you're living. You can't rent the house out that you buy through the NSP program. You can't use it as a summer house or a beach house or something. It has to be your primary residence.
All right. Then I'm seeing one more question. What is the difference between program delivery cost and the 10% admin cap? And could you give a specific example of what would be a program delivery cost?
The program delivery cost would be a situation where you go out and you do an appraisal for a property that you then acquire. That appraisal will count as a program delivery cost. Admin cost would be the salary for the person who hired the appraiser to go out and do the appraisal. It would be the cost of their their computer that they use to send the email to the appraiser, or how many hours they worked, or the phone bill that they have. Those would be administrative costs. The program delivery costs would be directly related to the property. If you can tie the cost to an address, then it is considered a development cost involved with that property.
And there is the policy alert that you can find in the HUD Exchange under NSP dealing with the difference between delivery cost and any other costs there.
All right, great. I am seeing no other questions. There were a couple other questions sprinkled in around where to find resources and in specific where to find the materials for this webinar. To reiterate, these materials will be posted on the HUD Resource Exchange. And as well, I pulled up right now some resource links if anyone would like to take a look. And like I said, no other questions. So what I'll do is pull up this evaluation link for everyone. We would love to have your feedback after this webinar. This link will be on the materials that we send out, and you'll also get a reminder tomorrow. We would love your feedback to make these webinars better in the future. So please fill these out for us. And HUD folks, I don't know if you have anything else to say, but that might be it for us.
Just one thing to emphasize with the SurveyMonkey is do not put any policy questions in there because it takes a while for us to get them. If you do have any questions, please go to the HUD Exchange, the Ask a Question website, and put them in there. That way we can get back to you quickly.
Great. Well, I think that does it for us today. I don't know if you have any other closing remarks, HUD, but that would be it.
Yep. I think we're good. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.